In a mansion where luxury and silence hide old resentments, an elderly woman lives as a shadow of her own home. A gesture of affection turns into a trap, and the dish of memory is served with cruelty. Unjustly placed in a gloomy nursing home, she writes letters to keep from losing her mind. But a forgotten note in a coat pocket awakens the right memory and changes everything. If this story has interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The warm breeze of Aspen, Colorado, drifted through the mansion windows, but it couldn't warm the atmosphere. Mrs. Beatrice adjusted the flowers in the living room vase, her delicate fingers carefully arranging each petal. At 73, she maintained a discreet elegance, her white hair always pulled back in a low bun, her gentle brown eyes observing the world with patience. That imposing house, with its colorful stained glass windows and imported furniture, should have been her home, but she felt like nothing more than a tolerated guest. Camilla entered the room with firm steps, her heels echoing on the Italian marble floor. Beatrice's daughter-in-law was a woman of striking presence, perfectly straightened dark hair, designer clothes, and a gaze that seemed to calculate every movement around her. She barely glanced at her mother-in-law before picking up the phone and starting to organize the family's next social event. Robert, Beatrice's son, had been in his office for hours. As a coffee export businessman, he lived between meetings, contracts, and international trips. The company he had built over 20 years now demanded all his attention, leaving little time to notice the subtleties happening within his own home. He loved his mother, of course, but believed she was well cared for, that Camilla was attentive, and that everything worked perfectly. Beatrice returned to her small room at the back of the house. It hadn't always been this way. When she first arrived years ago, after the apartment where she lived alone became too small for her needs, Robert had insisted she occupy the master suite on the second floor. But little by little, with Camilla's subtle suggestions about renovations and space redistribution, she had been moved to a smaller room, then to an even more discreet one, until finally settling in that little corner that looked more like a renovated storage room. She didn't complain. She never had. She had been raised in a time when gratitude and discretion were valued, where causing trouble in a child's family was almost a dishonor. So she smiled, thanked them, and became increasingly invisible. That afternoon, as she embroidered a towel in the small armchair by the window, Beatrice heard voices coming from the living room. Camilla was on the phone with a friend, and her tone was different from the one she used when Robert was around. It was colder, more calculating. The old woman couldn't hear everything, but some words reached her like arrows. Nuisance, antiquated, problem. She felt her chest tighten, but she continued embroidering, the needle moving in and out of the fabric with automatic precision, the result of decades of practice. When night fell, Robert finally emerged from his office. He looked tired, his shoulders slightly stooped under the weight of his responsibilities. Beatrice had prepared tea and biscuits, hoping her son would pass through the kitchen as he used to. But Camilla intercepted her husband in the living room, engaging him in conversations about the important dinner the following week, about the investors coming from New York City, about the need for everything to be perfect. Robert merely waved to his mother from afar, a quick and distracted gesture, before going upstairs to the bedroom with Camilla. Beatrice drank her tea alone, looking out the window at the illuminated garden. The hydrangeas she had planted years ago continued to bloom, indifferent to the loneliness that permeated that house. The next day, Camilla announced during breakfast that there would be a special dinner on Friday. International investors, a golden opportunity to expand Robert's business into the European market. Everything needed to be impeccable. The house would be decorated by professionals, the dinner would be prepared by a renowned chef, and every detail would be meticulously planned. Beatrice listened to everything in silence, eating her toast with jam. Then, with her characteristic soft voice, she said she would like to help, that she could prepare her special recipe for milk pudding, the one Robert had loved since childhood. Her son's eyes shone for a moment, a spark of affectionate memory piercing through the fog of professional worries. But Camilla was quick. With a smile that didn't reach her eyes, she thanked Beatrice for the offer, but explained that the menu was already set. that it would be sophisticated French cuisine and there was no room for changes. Robert distractedly agreed, already checking emails on his phone. Beatrice merely nodded, accustomed to being disregarded. However, on Thursday afternoon, when Camilla left for the beauty salon and Robert was in a meeting downtown, Beatrice decided to make a surprise. She would prepare the milk pudding as a special dessert, not to replace the chef's menu, but as a personal touch, a memory of the times when mother and son shared the kitchen on Sunday afternoons. She worked carefully, following the recipe she knew by heart. Eggs, condensed milk, sugar for the syrup. Each movement was automatic, laden with memories. When he was little, Robert always stole spoonfuls of the mixture before it went into the oven, and she would feign sternness while laughing. How many years had passed since then? How many layers of adult life had buried that smiling boy? The pudding turned out perfect, golden and shimmering. She carefully covered it and put it in the refrigerator, leaving a note beside it explaining that it was a special surprise for dinner. Her heart felt lighter. Perhaps that small gesture could bring a little warmth back to that house of marble and glass. Camilla arrived home a few hours later, her hair impeccable, her nails freshly done. She went straight to the kitchen to check on the preparations and saw the pudding. She read the note. Her face remained impassive, but something dangerous gleamed in her eyes. She looked around, making sure she was alone, and then opened the refrigerator again. With calculated movements, she uncovered the sugar jar that Beatrice had used to decorate the pudding, and from the cupboard, took out coarse salt. She poured the salt into the sugar jar, mixing well until they were indistinguishable. Then she took the pudding and generously sprinkled that mixture over its entire surface. She put everything back, adjusted the note exactly as it had been, and left the kitchen with a satisfied smile. On Friday, the house was transformed. Flowers everywhere, the table set with fine china, aromatic candles perfuming the air. The investors arrived punctually, elegant men and women speaking English and French, discussing markets and opportunities. The dinner proceeded perfectly, each dish more impressive than the last. Camilla shone as a hostess, and Robert felt proud. Then came the moment for dessert. The chef had already served his creation when Beatrice, shy but hopeful, appeared from the kitchen carrying the pudding. She explained with her gentle voice that it was a special recipe, a family tradition. Robert smiled, moved, and insisted that everyone try it. The investors, polite, accepted small portions. The first spoonful was followed by a heavy silence. One of the investors, a grey-moustached French gentleman, made a discreet grimace. Another, an elegant German woman in glasses, brought her hand to her mouth, trying to disguise it. Robert, who had eaten enthusiastically, remembering his childhood, felt the salty taste explode on his tongue. That wasn't sugar. It was salt, a lot of salt. The table fell into an awkward silence. Camilla was the first to react, standing up quickly and apologizing profusely in English, explaining that there had been a terrible mistake in the kitchen. The investors, polite, tried to downplay it, but the mood had shifted. The magic of the perfect dinner was broken. Conversations that had flowed naturally before now seemed forced. Beatrice was paralyzed, the plate still in her hands, not understanding what had happened. She had tasted the mixture before baking. Everything was fine. How could sugar have turned into salt? Her eyes sought her son's, looking for understanding, but Robert avoided her gaze, his face red with shame. The dinner ended earlier than planned. The investors departed with polite but cold smiles, promising to get in touch, a promise everyone knew was empty. When the door closed behind the last guest, the silence in the mansion was deafening. Camilla turned to Beatrice with an expression of studied disappointment. She didn't shout, didn't accuse directly. Her strategy was more subtle, more effective. With a voice laden with false concern, she asked if Beatrice was feeling well, if she wasn't confusing things lately. Robert, still processing the embarrassment, heard those words, and something was planted in his mind. Beatrice tried to explain, to say she was sure she had used sugar, that something must have happened, but her words sounded fragile even to her own ears. How to? Prove something that had no witnesses? How to defend herself when the evidence was there, salty and undeniable, on the plates on the table. That night, Beatrice couldn't sleep. Lying in her small room, she relived every moment in the kitchen. She was absolutely certain she had used sugar. Her fingers knew the texture, her eyes recognized the grains. Someone had changed it. But who? And why? The answer seemed obvious, yet at the same time impossible to believe. Camilla wouldn't be capable of such cruelty, would she? In the following days, the atmosphere in the house changed. Robert received calls from the investors cancelling the deal. The excuses were vague, but the message was clear. The opportunity was lost. He spent more time in the office, avoiding conversations, immersed in spreadsheets and attempts to salvage the agreement. Camilla, for her part, began a silent and methodical campaign. During breakfast one day, she casually mentioned that she had found the car keys in the refrigerator. Robert looked up, confused. Camilla explained that Beatrice had probably put them there without realizing, a sign that perhaps she needed more attention. The old woman vehemently denied it, saying she had never touched the keys. But Camilla merely smiled with compassion, that smile that spoke louder than words. A few days later, it was the TV remote control's turn to appear inside the oven. Then, reading glasses inside the cereal box. Small incidents that, isolated, could be coincidences, but together began to form a worrying pattern in Robert's mind. Was his mother truly losing her lucidity? Beatrice perceived the trap closing around her, but she didn't know how to escape. Each time she tried to defend herself, she sounded like someone in denial about her own condition. Every protest made her seem more confused. She began to distrust her own movements, doubting her certainties, questioning her own sanity. The cruelest blow came one Sunday morning. Beatrice woke up and went to her small dresser to look for her rosary, the one she had received for her first communion decades ago. It wasn't there. She turned the room upside down, her heart racing. She searched every drawer, every corner. Nothing. That object was sacred to her, a symbol of faith that had accompanied her entire life. She left the room searching, increasingly distressed. That's when she heard Camilla calling Robert from the kitchen, her voice laden with theatrical surprise. When Beatrice arrived there, she saw her daughter-in-law holding her rosary, which was inside a plastic bag, frozen in a block of ice in the freezer. Camilla shook her head mournfully, while Robert looked at his mother with a mixture of concern and disbelief. Beatrice felt her legs weaken. She hadn't put that there. She would never do something like that with such a precious object. But how to explain? How to convince someone of her innocence when all the evidence pointed against her? Tears streamed down her face, not from sadness but from helpless indignation. That afternoon, as the rosary thawed on a dish towel, Beatrice sat in the garden. The hydrangeas swayed in the breeze, indifferent to the human drama. She realized she was being systematically destroyed, her credibility undermined, her sanity questioned. And the worst part was that her son, the boy she had raised with so much love, was believing that narrative. Camilla watched from the window, satisfied with her work. Every step was calculated, every action planned to appear as the result of an elderly woman's mental deterioration. She knew she couldn't be aggressive or obvious. The key was subtlety, planting doubts, creating a pattern that would eventually lead Robert to make the decision she desired. And that decision was approaching. Camilla had already researched clinics, already knew exactly where to send her mother-in-law. Not one of those expensive and comfortable places Robert would imagine, but an institution in the grittier fringes of New York City, where the fees were low and the conditions questionable. She even had her speech prepared, full of feigned concern and love, about how Beatrice needed specialized care that they couldn't provide at home. Robert was in his office when he received a call from the security company. Apparently, the house alarm had gone off during the early hours, and the cameras showed someone walking through the living room at 3 in the morning. He asked to review the footage and saw his mother, in her nightgown, walking barefoot through the room, appearing disoriented. Camilla was beside him as he watched, and her soft voice whispered that it was worrying, that Beatrice could get hurt, that perhaps it was time to consider other options. What Robert didn't know was that Camilla had manipulated the situation. That night she had put a sleeping pill in Beatrice's tea, enough to make her drowsy and confused, and then made noise in the hallway so the old woman would leave her room, disoriented by the medication. The cameras only captured the result, not the cause. Beatrice began to realize she was being medicated. Her mornings became hazy, her memory failed more than usual. She tried to refuse the tea Camilla insisted on bringing to her room every night, but her daughter-in-law was persistent, always with excuses about how it was good for sleeping, how it would help her relax. And when Beatrice resisted, Camilla would call Robert, making it seem as if her mother-in-law was being difficult and irrational. One afternoon, Beatrice decided to write a letter to her son. She needed to put everything on paper, explain what was happening, implore him to see the truth. She wrote with a trembling but determined hand, recounting the strange situations, how she felt manipulated, how she feared for her safety in that house. She sealed the envelope and left it on Robert's office desk, certain that he would read it. But Camilla found the letter first. She opened it, read every word, and her face remained impassive. Then, calmly, she tore the paper into tiny pieces and threw it in the trash. Later, when Robert asked if any mail had arrived, Camilla said no, that there was nothing important. Months passed, and Beatrice's situation deteriorated not of her own accord, but due to the constant manipulation she was subjected to. She barely left her room, afraid to touch anything, fearing it would be used against her. Her appetite diminished, her hair began to lose its luster, and dark circles formed under her eyes. She was being systematically broken. Robert watched his mother waste away, and, ironically, that only confirmed the suspicions Camilla had planted. To him, these were clear signs of dementia, of someone who could no longer care for herself. He didn't realize that it was precisely the toxic environment that had created that condition. His guilt grew daily, but he directed it to the wrong place, feeling guilty for not having realized sooner how much his mother needed professional help. It was on a rainy June night that Camilla finally made her decisive move. She prepared a special dinner, lit candles, and played Robert's favorite music softly. When he arrived home from work, exhausted and worried about the businesses that hadn't fully recovered yet, she greeted him with a prolonged hug and an affectionate kiss. During dinner, Camilla started slowly. She talked about how much she loved their family, about how she wanted the best for everyone. She mentioned that she had been observing Beatrice with growing concern, that the strange situations were intensifying. Then, with tears in her eyes that she could produce at will, she said she was afraid. Afraid that Beatrice would get hurt, afraid that she would cause a serious accident, afraid of not doing enough to help her. Robert felt his chest tighten. He also had these fears, although he tried to ignore them. Camilla continued, saying she had researched the matter, that she had discreetly spoken with a doctor friend, and that perhaps it was time to consider a place where Beatrice could receive proper care, where trained professionals could monitor her 24 hours a day. The word asylum was never mentioned. Camilla was smarter than that. She spoke of a specialized center, a resting clinic, a therapeutic environment. She showed photos of a place that looked welcoming in the website images, with well-maintained gardens and bright rooms. What she didn't show was that those photos were of a completely different place from what she actually had in mind. Robert initially resisted. The idea of sending his mother to any institution seemed like a betrayal, an abandonment. But Camilla was patient and persuasive. She argued that it wasn't abandonment, it was love, that it was precisely because they loved Beatrice that they needed to ensure she had the care she deserved, that keeping his mother there, in her current condition, would be selfish on their part. In the following weeks, Camilla intensified the pressure. She orchestrated more incidents. One day, the stove was left on with nothing on it, and she called Robert running, saying Beatrice had been in the kitchen earlier. Another day, the bathtub faucet overflowed, flooding part of the hallway. There was always a way to make it seem like Beatrice was responsible, always an excuse that sounded plausible. Robert was being surrounded by fabricated evidence, and his resistance began to weaken. He loved his mother deeply, but he was also exhausted. Business demanded constant attention. Camilla was always in his ear, and he began to believe that perhaps this was truly the best solution, that his mother would be safer, better cared for in the hands of professionals. Beatrice noticed the change. She saw the glances Robert cast her way, a mixture of pity and concern. She tried to talk to him, but there was always something that interrupted him. Camilla always appeared with some urgency. The old woman felt like a ghost in her own life, invisible and powerless. One afternoon, while Beatrice was in the garden trying to find a moment of peace among the flowers, she heard voices coming from the office. The window was ajar and she didn't intend to eavesdrop, but the words reached her with painful clarity. It was Robert and Camilla discussing her. Camilla presented arguments in a calm and rational voice. She spoke about quality of life, about safety, about how much better it would be for everyone. Robert, meanwhile, seemed torn, his voice laden with doubt and guilt. Beatrice heard her daughter-in-law mention that she had already reserved a spot, that the place was wonderful, that it would be a smooth transition. Beatrice's heart stopped. They really planned to send her somewhere. She wanted to go in there, scream the truth, beg her son to see what was happening. But her feet didn't move. What would she say? That her daughter-in-law hated her and was manipulating everything. Without proof, it would only sound like paranoia, like another sign of mental confusion. That night, Beatrice couldn't eat. She stayed in her room looking at the few photographs she still kept on her dresser. Robert as a baby in her arms, Robert as a child in a school uniform, smiling toothlessly. Robert as a young man, receiving his university diploma. Where was that boy now? Where was the son who loved her unconditionally? The decision was made on a Monday morning. Robert entered Beatrice's room with a serious expression and red eyes, as if he had been crying. He sat on the edge of the bed and held his mother's hands. With a choked voice, he said he had something difficult to discuss. Beatrice already knew. She squeezed her son's hands and waited, her face a mask of serenity that hid the inner panic. Robert explained, with carefully chosen words, that he thought it best for her to go to a place where she could be properly cared for. That it wasn't because he didn't love her, but precisely because he loved her and wanted the best for her. Beatrice looked into her son's eyes and saw sincerity. He truly believed it. He really thought he was doing the right thing. Camilla had done a perfect job, turning love into a weapon, using Robert's genuine concern as a tool for manipulation. The old woman realized there were no arguments that could change that situation. The narrative was already built, the decision already made. With dignity, Beatrice merely nodded. She asked when it would be, and Robert said the following Friday. She would have a few days to prepare. He promised. He would visit often, that it would be a beautiful and comfortable place, that she would make friends. The lies flowed easily from his mouth, not because he was dishonest, but because he believed them. The following days were strange. Beatrice packed her few possessions into a small suitcase. Simple clothes, some photos, her favorite books. Camilla watched her with a satisfied smile she could barely disguise. Victory was near. Finally, that inconvenient presence would be removed from her home, from her life. On Thursday night, Beatrice asked to have dinner alone with Robert. Camilla tried to include herself, but Robert, perhaps feeling he owed that last night to his mother, agreed to the request. They ate in heavy silence in the kitchen, the place where so many memories had been created years ago. Beatrice looked at her son and tried one last time. She said she loved him, that she would always love him, but that she was afraid of where she was being sent. She asked if he had really visited the place, if he knew the people who would work there. Robert, without perceiving the subtlety of the question, merely repeated what Camilla had told him, that it was a highly recommended place, that she would be fine. That night Beatrice didn't sleep. She lay looking at the ceiling, organizing memories in her mind, preparing for what was to come. She didn't know exactly what awaited her, but her instinct told her it would be nothing like what Robert imagined. Friday morning arrived covered by grey clouds that threatened rain. Beatrice put on her prettiest outfit, a navy blue skirt and white blouse she kept for special occasions. She carefully combed her hair, put on an antique brooch that had belonged to her mother. If she was going to face the unknown, she would do it with dignity. Robert had hired a private driver for the trip. He himself wouldn't go. He had an important meeting he couldn't cancel. Camilla had also come up with an excuse, something about unpostponable commitments. So it would be just Beatrice and a stranger, driving for hours to New York City, to a destination she hadn't chosen. Before leaving, Robert embraced his mother for a long time. She felt his tears wetting her shoulder and wanted to console him, to say everything would be all right. But the words wouldn't come out. He promised to visit her the following weekend, promised to call every day, promises that sounded empty in the morning air. Camilla said goodbye with a false embrace and sweet words that made Beatrice's stomach churn. But the old woman maintained her composure, got into the car with her head held high, and didn't look back as the vehicle began to pull away from the mansion. The journey lasted almost 5 hours. The driver was a silent man who didn't try to make unnecessary conversation, for which Beatrice was grateful. She looked out the window, watching the landscape change, the mountains of Aspen, Colorado, giving way to plains, then to the growing urban sprawl as they approached the New York metropolis. When they began to enter the outskirts, Beatrice noticed that the buildings became older, the streets narrower, the activity different. This did not look like the way to a high-end clinic. Her heart began to beat faster, a sense of alarm growing in her chest. The car stopped in front of a low, grey building, with walls stained with dampness and bars on the windows. There were no gardens, no welcoming facade like the photos Camilla had shown Robert. Beatrice felt panic rise, but the driver was already opening her door, taking her suitcase from the trunk. A corpulent woman in a white lab coat appeared at the entrance. She had a tired and indifferent expression, like someone who had seen that scene many times. She checked a paper, confirmed Beatrice Sterling's name, and made an impatient gesture for her to enter. Beatrice wanted to protest, wanted to get back into the car and demand to be taken home. But the driver was already getting into the vehicle, already leaving, and the woman in the lab coat was already holding her arm with unnecessary force, pulling her into the building. The smell was the first thing that hit her, a mixture of cheap disinfectant, old urine, and something more, something of hopelessness that seemed to permeate the walls. The corridor was dark, lit by flickering fluorescent lights. From somewhere distant came sounds of groans and muffled cries. Beatrice was led down an endless corridor to a small room at the back. It had no windows, just a narrow bed with grey sheets, a small table and a plastic chair. The walls were a dirty white with mold stains in the corners. The woman threw the suitcase onto the bed and said in a monotonous voice that the rules would be explained later. Then she left, locking the door with a key that jingled from the outside. Beatrice stood there, in shock. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be the place Robert had imagined. He wouldn't do this to her intentionally. It meant that Camilla had lied to everyone, that she had orchestrated everything down to that last cruel detail. She sat on the bed, which creaked under her minimal weight, and tried to process the situation. She needed to warn Robert. She needed him to know the truth. But how? There was no phone in the room, no way to communicate with the outside world. The hours passed slowly. No one came. No explanation was given. No food was offered. Beatrice just sat there, in the growing darkness as afternoon turned into night, trying to maintain her sanity, trying not to surrender to the despair that threatened to consume her. Finally, it was already night when the door opened again. It was another staff member, younger but equally indifferent. She brought a tray with something that was supposedly dinner, a watery broth with unidentifiable pieces floating in it. Beside it, 2 white pills and a glass of water. Beatrice asked what the pills were. The staff member merely said it was standard medication, that everyone took it. When Beatrice refused, saying she didn't need medicine, that she had no condition requiring medication, the woman simply shrugged and left, taking the pills, but leaving the food. Beatrice looked at that broth and felt nauseous, but her stomach was rumbling. She hadn't eaten since breakfast. Reluctantly, she tasted it. It was bad, unsalted, tasteless, but it was sustenance. She ate enough, not to starve and push the rest aside. That first night was the longest of her life. The mattress was thin and uneven, full of lumps that pressed into her back. From the corridor came strange sounds, footsteps, banging doors, whispering voices. She thought of Robert, wondered what he might be doing at that moment. Was he thinking of her? Was he feeling any remorse? Or had Camilla already convinced him that everything was fine, that his mother was being well cared for. The days began to blur together. A cruel routine established itself, waking up to the sound of banging doors, receiving a tray with watery coffee and stale bread, being alone in the room for endless hours. Sometimes they would come and try to force her to take the pills. She resisted, but realized it only marked her as problematic. In the third week, Beatrice was transferred to a room with another resident. She was a woman of about 60 named Delia, who had lively and intelligent eyes despite the oppressive environment. They began to converse in whispers when they were alone, and Beatrice discovered that Delia was there for similar reasons, a daughter who didn't want to deal with the responsibility of caring for her mother, who had found a convenient and cheap solution in that place. Delia had contacts in the outside world. Her brother visited occasionally, bringing small luxuries, paper and pencils when the guards weren't looking. She offered some to Beatrice, realizing the other woman desperately needed a way to express what she felt. Beatrice began to write, letters she knew would never be sent, but which kept her mind active, her lucidity intact. She wrote to Robert, telling him about the real place she was in, about the difference between the promise and the reality. She wrote about her memories, about the moments they shared, about the love she still felt despite everything. Writing became her salvation. On the scraps of paper Delia managed to get, she poured out her soul. She described the day Robert was born, the joy of holding him for the first time. She talked about the nights she stayed awake when he was sick, about the birthdays they celebrated together, about the dreams she had for his future. Meanwhile, at the mansion in Aspen, Colorado, life went on. Camilla had transformed Beatrice's old room into an additional closet. She had thrown a party to celebrate the house's renovation, invited friends for elaborate lunches, and posted photos on social media showing the impeccable, modern mansion. Robert had tried to call the clinic several times in the first few days. The number Camilla had given him always went to voicemail. She explained that the place had strict policies about calls, that it was part of the therapeutic process to minimize initial contact to facilitate adaptation. When Robert finally insisted on visiting, Camilla had an excuse ready. The clinic was under quarantine due to a flu outbreak. They weren't accepting visitors. Temporarily. It would only be a few weeks. Robert, always busy and trusting his wife, accepted the explanation. But something began to bother him, a vague feeling he couldn't name. The dreams began around that time. Robert would wake up in the middle of the night sweating, fragments of childhood memories flooding his mind. He dreamed of his mother in the kitchen, teaching him to make milk pudding. He dreamed of her singing him to sleep, a lullaby he hadn't thought of in decades. He dreamed of the scent of flowers from the garden she cultivated with such care. Began to miss her presence in the house. That quiet, gentle presence that had always been there, like a comforting constant. The mansion seemed colder now, emptier, even with Camilla filling every space with her friends and social events. There was an absence that couldn't be filled with noise and movement. One night, unable to sleep, Robert went down to the basement. It had been years since he'd been there. It was a storage space he had practically forgotten. But that night something pulled him. Among dusty boxes and old furniture, he found a wooden box he recognized immediately. It was from the time his mother had moved into the mansion, things she had brought from her old house. With trembling hands, Robert opened the box. Inside, there were treasures of memory. His first baby shoe, small and white, carefully preserved. His first school medal, from a math competition in elementary school. Yellowed photographs of birthday parties, old Christmases, simple moments brimming with happiness. At the bottom of the box, he found letters. They were letters he himself had written to his mother during a teenage exchange program. He opened them and read, recognizing his youthful handwriting. In each one, he ended with, "I love you, Mom," or "I miss you," or "I can't wait to come home." Tears began to roll down his face. When was the last time he had said those words to her? Among the letters, there was a photograph he didn't remember seeing. It was of him at about 10 years old, wearing a very large apron all covered in flour. His mother was beside him, also in an apron, laughing at the camera. He turned the photo over and saw the caption written in Beatrice's delicate handwriting. Robert learning to make milk pudding, his favorite recipe. Something broke inside him. the pudding, the night of the disastrous dinner, the expression on his mother's face, that genuine confusion, that deep hurt. What if she was telling the truth? What if it really hadn't been her fault? Robert sat on the cold basement floor, surrounded by memories, and for the first time allowed himself to question the narrative Camilla had so carefully constructed. He began to review each incident in his mind. The keys in the refrigerator, the remote in the oven, the frozen rosary. Each situation seemed so convenient, so perfectly constructed to paint a picture of dementia. And his mother had always denied it, always seemed genuinely confused about how those things happened. What if she wasn't confused? What if someone was orchestrating everything? The distrust, once planted, began to grow. Robert observed Camilla more closely in the following days. He noticed how she deflected conversations whenever he mentioned visiting his mother. He realized how quickly she changed the subject when he asked questions about the clinic. He saw a flash of something in her eyes, something cold and calculating that he had never allowed himself to see before. One afternoon, he decided to look for documents related to his mother's institutionalization. Camilla was at a charity luncheon, so he had the house to himself. In her office, locked in a drawer whose key she thought he didn't know where it was, Robert found a folder. Inside, there were contracts and documents, but the clinic's address was different from the one Camilla had shown him. This one was in a part of New York City that Robert knew to be problematic, far from the sophisticated neighborhoods where true high-end clinics were located. His heart began to beat faster. He picked up the phone and called the number on the official documents. A sharp voice answered. Robert identified himself and asked about his mother, Beatrice Sterling. There was a moment of silence, then the voice said she was indeed there, but that she didn't receive visitors without prior authorization. When Robert said he was her son, that he wanted to visit her immediately, the person on the other end became defensive, saying they would need to verify, that he should call the next day. Robert hung up with trembling hands. Something was very wrong. Why would he need authorization to visit his own mother? Why was the tone of voice so different from what he would expect from a professional establishment? The pieces began to fit together, forming a horrifying picture. He didn't wait until the next day. Robert hired a private investigator that same afternoon, someone a lawyer friend had recommended. He asked for a complete investigation into the institution where his mother was, about the conditions of the place, about everything. The investigator promised results in 48 hours. Those were the longest 48 hours of Robert's life. He could barely look at Camilla without feeling nauseous. During dinner, she casually commented on how the house was more organized, more harmonious. Robert had to restrain himself from exploding right there. He needed proof, certainty, before confronting her. The report arrived by email on Thursday night. Robert read it in his office, the door locked. Every word was like a stab. The investigator described a neglected place with reports of mistreatment, with a history of sanitary violations. There were photos, images of the grey and decaying building, so different from the photos of flourishing gardens Camilla had shown. The investigator had also discovered something else. The monthly payments Robert had authorized, substantial amounts intended, for his mother's care were being diverted. Only a minimal fraction reached the institution. The rest went into an account which, with further investigation, was revealed to be in Camilla's name. She was profiting from her mother-in-law's suffering. Robert felt a rage he had never experienced before, pure, burning, righteous. But along with the rage came overwhelming guilt. His mother had been suffering for months, and he had not only allowed it, but funded it. He had been a blind fool, manipulated by someone he trusted completely. That night he couldn't sleep next to Camilla. He invented an excuse about work and stayed in the office. He planned every step of what he would do. In the morning, without telling Camilla, he left early. He drove himself to New York City, following the institution's real address. The journey was a torment. Robert imagined what he would find, how his mother would be. Would she forgive him? Would he be able to explain that he had been deceived, that he never wanted that for her? Tears occasionally blurred his vision, and he had to pull over to compose himself. When he arrived at the building, the shock was physical. That horrible, dirty, decaying place. His mother had been there for months. Months. He entered with authority, identifying himself and demanding to see Beatrice immediately. The staff member tried to stop him with bureaucracy, but Robert was not in the mood for protocols. He threatened to call the police, threatened lawsuits until they finally led him to her. The room was small and windowless, exactly as the investigator had described. And there, sitting on the narrow bed, was his mother. Robert barely recognized her. She had lost a lot of weight, her face more angular, her hair less cared for. But when she looked up and saw him, something lit up within her. Recognition, relief, and something more. Hope. Robert crossed the room in 2 steps and knelt before her, taking her hands. They were so cold, so fragile. He tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the words choked in his throat. He could only say, "I'm so sorry, I'm so very sorry," as tears fell uncontrollably. Beatrice touched her son's face with trembling fingers. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was weak but firm. "I knew you would remember, I knew you would come back for me." Robert wasted no time. He signed all the necessary papers to take his mother out of there immediately, ignoring the administration's protests. He wrapped his mother in his own coat, as she was dressed only in thin, worn clothes, and guided her out of that horrible place. Every step down the dark corridor was a silent promise that never again would she go through something like this. In the car, Beatrice remained quiet, looking out the window, as if she couldn't quite believe she was leaving. Robert drove with one hand, the other holding his mother's hand as if he was afraid she would disappear if he let go. He spoke continuously, apologizing, promising that he would do everything differently, that he had discovered the truth. Beatrice merely squeezed her son's hand. She didn't need detailed explanations at that moment. She was too exhausted emotionally and physically. But there was a peace in her heart she hadn't felt in months. Her son had returned to her. The boy she had raised was still there, beneath all the layers of responsibility and manipulation. The drive back to Aspen, Colorado was mostly silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't heavy or uncomfortable, but rather contemplative. Robert stopped frequently, offering water, food, asking if she was well. Beatrice accepted everything with gratitude, still processing the drastic change in her situation. When the car finally pulled into the mansion's garage, it was late afternoon. Robert helped his mother out, supporting her carefully. Camilla was in the living room, on the phone, and when she saw the two of them entering, her face turned pale. The phone slipped from her hands. She tried to speak, tried to smile, tried to feign happy surprise, but Robert cut her off with a cold wave of his hand. His voice, when he spoke, was steel. "You have 10 minutes to pack your things and leave this house. Only the essentials. The rest I'll send later, if I'm feeling generous enough." Camilla tried to protest, tried to explain, the words tumbling out. She spoke of misunderstandings, of doing what was best for everyone, of love. But Robert wasn't listening. He knew every trick now, every manipulation, every lie. He had seen the proof, he knew the truth. And there were no words that could undo what she had done. His daughter-in-law tried one last card, running to Beatrice, trying to hug her, begging for forgiveness. But Beatrice merely stepped away, her gaze serene but firm. She said nothing. She didn't need to. That silence said everything. Camilla then realized she had lost, that there was no turning back, that her manipulation had finally met its end. Camilla rushed upstairs to the bedroom, came back with a hastily packed suitcase. She still tried to argue, threatened lawyers, spoke of rights. Robert merely pointed to the door. When she finally left, driving her luxurious car off the property, it was as if a gigantic weight had been lifted from the house. Robert took his mother to the master bedroom, the one that should have been hers from the start. He had dismissed the housekeeper and the cook at the same time, discovering that both were complicit with Camilla, actively assisting in the manipulation. The house was empty except for the two of them, but it was a good, necessary solitude. He prepared a warm bath for his mother, laid out her best towels, opened expensive toiletries Camilla had accumulated. Beatrice stayed a long time in the tub, letting the warm water wash away not only the physical dirt but also part of the trauma of the past few months. When she emerged wearing a soft bathrobe, she looked a little more like herself. Robert prepared tea and made buttered toast. It was simple, but made with care and love. They ate together in the kitchen, the same place where so many memories had been created decades ago. Slowly, Beatrice began to speak, telling him about the months in the institution, about Delia, about the letters she had written. Robert listened with tears silently streaming down his face, each word a reminder of his failure to protect her. But Beatrice didn't speak with bitterness, only with the relief of finally being able to tell her truth. She spoke of how she had held on to hope, of how she knew that eventually he would find out, of the faith she had in the love between them. That night, Robert slept in an armchair beside his mother's bed, unable to leave her alone even for a few hours. He woke frequently, checking if she was still there, if it wasn't a dream. Beatrice also woke occasionally, and each time she saw her son there watching over her, she felt a warmth in her chest that the sadness of the past few months hadn't completely managed to extinguish. The following days were ones of delicate reconstruction. Robert cancelled all his professional commitments for 2 weeks, something unthinkable before. He hired a new team for the house, people he personally interviewed and vetted. Gentle people who treated Beatrice with the respect she deserved. He also took his mother to the doctor, a trusted professional who examined her thoroughly. The damage wasn't just emotional. Beatrice was malnourished, vitamin deficient, with sleep problems, but nothing irreversible. With proper care, she would recover. The doctor was clear, however. The emotional trauma would require time and patience. Robert began to undo the changes Camilla had made in the house. The closet that had been Beatrice's room became a personal space for her again, now even better, more comfortable. He brought back the boxes of memories from the basement, put old photos in new frames, restored his mother's presence in every corner of the mansion. But the biggest transformation was in the garden. Beatrice had always loved gardening, and Camilla had let everything die, replacing it with minimalist decor and stones. Robert hired a landscaper and worked alongside him, planting hydrangeas, roses, daisies, all the flowers his mother loved. They spent hours together there, hands in the soil, talking or just enjoying the companionable silence. One day, Beatrice casually mentioned that she missed cooking. Robert immediately led her to the kitchen and told her she owned that space. They began to cook together again, as they did when he was a child. Old recipes were resurrected, new ones were tried. The kitchen, which had been sterile under Camilla's command, came back to life with smells, laughter. It was during one of these cooking sessions that Beatrice mentioned the milk pudding. Robert froze for a moment, memories of that terrible night returning. But then he looked at his mother and said he wanted to learn to make it again, the right way. That he wanted to create a new memory to replace the bad one. They made the pudding together, step by step. Beatrice guided, Robert followed the instructions with almost reverent care. When it was ready, they tasted it together. It was perfect, just sweet enough, with that creamy texture only her recipe had. Robert ate with tears in his eyes, and Beatrice smiled, squeezing his hand. Weeks turned into months. The house breathed again. Where there was once tension and manipulation, now there was peace and authenticity. Beatrice visibly flourished, gaining weight, her eyes regaining their sparkle, her hair being cared for. She returned to embroidering, reading, tending the garden. She returned to being herself. Robert also changed. He learned to say no to unnecessary commitments, to prioritize moments with his mother, to value what truly mattered. Business continued to thrive, but it was no longer his sole reason for living. He had found a balance he didn't know was possible. One afternoon, a few months after the rescue, Robert received an envelope in the mail. It was from Camilla. Inside, a long letter where she apologized, explained, asked for a chance to talk. Robert read it to the end, recognizing every manipulation technique she used, every attempt to play the victim. He showed the letter to Beatrice. His mother read it in silence and then handed it back to her son. The decision is yours. But remember that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or allowing someone to hurt you again. Robert nodded. He tore up the letter and threw it in the trash. He didn't respond. Didn't give Camilla the satisfaction of knowing he had read it. It was a closed chapter. Beatrice's 74th birthday arrived on a clear spring morning. Robert woke early, animated in a way he hadn't felt in years. He had decorated the house with flowers from the garden they had cultivated together, prepared a special breakfast, and had a surprise he had been planning for weeks. Beatrice came downstairs and found the table beautifully set, with her favorite flowers in delicate vases. There was warm French bread, fresh fruit, natural juices, and in the center of the table, a small milk pudding that Robert had made himself in the early hours, following her recipe exactly. Beatrice's eyes filled with happy tears. They had coffee together unhurriedly, talking about plans for the day, about the garden, about small, everyday joys. It was a simple but deeply significant scene. After the meal, Robert asked his mother to sit in the living room. He had something important to say. With slightly trembling hands, he handed her a folder of documents. Beatrice opened it, confused, and began to read. They were property transfers. The mansion, the properties Robert had acquired over the years, substantial investments. Everything was being transferred into her name. Beatrice looked up, shocked. "Son, what is this? You don't have to do this." Robert knelt before her, taking her hands exactly as he had done in that horrible room months ago, but now with a completely different meaning. "You built all of this, Mom," he said, his voice choked. "You raised me alone after Dad left us. You worked 2 jobs to give me an education. You never complained, never gave up. Every brick of this company, every achievement I've had was possible because of the sacrifices you made. This isn't charity. It's justice. It's yours by right." Beatrice was openly weeping now. She tried to protest, to say it wasn't necessary, but Robert was firm. She deserved security, deserved to know that she would never again be vulnerable, that no one could ever control or discard her again. That was him offering not just material possessions, but also respect, recognition, and above all, love. They spent the rest of the day in quiet celebration. They walked through the garden, now lush with spring flowers. They had lunch on the terrace, enjoying the gentle sun. Robert also gave her other gifts, things he knew she would like: books she had mentioned wanting to read, a soft wool shawl, an antique music box that played the lullaby she used to sing to him. In the afternoon, as they rested in the garden, Beatrice asked about Camilla. Robert confessed that he had learned through an acquaintance that she was living in a small apartment in New York City, working a common job. The money she had diverted was recovered through legal action, and she faced lawsuits that would leave her without resources for years. The old woman was quiet for a moment, then said, "I don't take pleasure in her suffering, but I understand that actions have consequences. She made choices, and now she lives with them." Robert agreed. There was no satisfaction in revenge, only the relief that justice had been served and that they could move forward. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in oranges and pinks, Robert prepared tea and brought out the pudding he had made that morning. They ate sitting on the grass, as they did when he was a child, and the world seemed infinitely simpler. The taste was just right, sweet and comforting, a link between past and present. "Son," Beatrice said softly, "you know I've already forgiven you, don't you? You were deceived, manipulated. What matters is that you woke up, that you came back to me." Robert felt the tears return. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he whispered, "but I am grateful for it every day." Beatrice touched his face as she did when he was little. "We all make mistakes. What defines us are not the mistakes, but how we choose to correct them. You chose love, you chose truth, that's what matters." They stayed there until night fell completely, the stars beginning to appear in the clear sky of Aspen, Colorado. The temperature cooled, and Robert brought blankets for the 2 of them. They sat side by side, listening to the night sounds of the garden, the crickets chirping, the gentle wind in the trees. Robert thought about everything that had happened, how blind he had been, how lost. He thought about Camilla, and how love can be used as a weapon when in the wrong hands. But he also thought about how true love, that between mother and son, had managed to survive everything. It had been tested almost, destroyed, but it had endured. Beatrice, for her part, thought about her journey, the dark months in the institution, the fear, the loneliness. But she also thought about how she had never lost hope, how she had known deep in her heart that her son would return to her. Faith had not been in vain. Love is never in vain. "Mom," Robert said suddenly, "tell me stories from when I was little, the ones you used to tell before I fell asleep." Beatrice smiled, surprised but happy, and she began to speak, her soft voice enveloping them like a hug. She spoke of first steps, first words, childhood mischief and tender moments. Robert listened as if hearing for the first time, forgotten memories coming back to life. The following weeks established a new routine, one built on mutual respect and genuine love. Robert continued to manage his businesses, but from home whenever possible. He installed a modern office where a guest room used to be, allowing him to work and still be close to his mother. Beatrice returned to participating in community groups, made new friends, rediscovered old hobbies. She joined a book club, started watercolor classes, and even volunteered at a local charity. She was no longer confined or diminished, but free to be fully herself. The house had completely changed its energy. Where Camilla's calculated coldness once resided, now there was authentic warmth. Where there was once superficiality, now there was depth. The cold marble furniture was replaced by warm wood. The impersonal decorations gave way to family photos and artwork that truly meant something. Robert also started dating again, but this time with open eyes. He introduced Patricia to his mother, a kind teacher who worked at a local school. The difference was striking. Patricia treated Beatrice with genuine respect, was interested in her stories, asked for her recipes. There was no competition or manipulation, just appreciation. One afternoon, the three of them were in the garden when Patricia asked Beatrice to teach her how to make milk pudding. The elderly woman smiled and led the young woman to the kitchen. Robert watched them from the window, his heart full of gratitude. This was the life that should have been from the beginning. This was the real family built on truth and love. Months turned into a year. On Beatrice's 75th birthday, the house was full of life. Friends she had made, neighbors, members of her community groups. Patricia helped serve, laughing and talking with everyone. Robert watched his mother, radiant at the center of attention, telling stories and giving out hugs. This was the Beatrice who had almost been lost, who had almost been buried alive in a horrible place. But she had survived, and not only survived, but prospered. She was stronger now, her kindness tempered with wisdom, her sweetness balanced with firmness. Suffering hadn't broken her, it had refined her. Robert raised a toast. To the strongest woman I know, to my mother, who taught me the true meaning of love, forgiveness, and resilience. Everyone drank, and Beatrice, with tears in her eyes but a smile on her face, thanked them with an emotional voice. When the party ended and the house became quiet again, mother and son sat in the garden, as was now their ritual. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, filling the air with a soft fragrance. The moon shone above, silvery and serene. "Are you happy, Mom?" Robert asked. Beatrice looked around at the garden they had cultivated together, at the house that was now truly a home, at her son beside her. "I am," she replied with simplicity. "I am very happy." And Robert realized he was too. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, he was genuinely at peace. There were no masks, no lies, no manipulations, just pure and true love between mother and son, exactly as it should be. The garden continued to flourish, each season bringing new colors, new scents. And in that garden, two souls who had survived the darkness found their light again. Time had not erased the scars, but it had taught that scars are simply proof that we survive, that we heal, that we are stronger than we imagined. And so, under the starry sky of Aspen, Colorado, with the scent of hydrangeas in the air and the soft sounds of the night all around, Beatrice and Robert found what everyone seeks, the peace of being exactly where they should be, with whom they should be, being exactly who they are. Dear listeners, we hope Beatrice and Robert's story has deeply touched your hearts. Stories like this remind us of the strength of true love and the importance of looking beyond appearances. To continue experiencing intense emotions like this, we have a special playlist full of other stories that explore family bonds, forgiveness, and redemption. You can find it by clicking here. If this narrative moved you, Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. It helps us continue bringing touching and true stories every day. And tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced or do you know someone who went through situations of family manipulation? How can true love overcome even the most difficult moments? We await you in the comments to talk about this emotional story.